Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Flying Chariots The Rise. Tonight we have the honor of having as our guest an experienced investigator of the supernatural, a man whose journey into the paranormal began in the picture-perfect landscapes of Cache Valley. Our guest John hails from this scenic region, and his fascination with the supernatural was ignited at the tender age of only 8. Growing up in a farmhouse that echoed with the whispers of the mid-1880s, he soon realized that his home was anything but ordinary. Spooky knocking noises, the unmistakable sound of boots running up the stairs, and mysteriously disappearing objects painted a vivid picture of the strange occurrences that marked his childhood. The fulcrum of John's paranormal odyssey was the elusive man in the hat, a ghostly figure who kept reappearing in his life. But instead of giving in to fear, John's encounters fueled an unquenchable curiosity about the unknown. For the last 3 decades, he has dedicated his life to unraveling the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of the western United States. John has stepped beyond the veil of the ordinary and collected first-hand accounts of the mysterious. His magnum opus, the Stranger Bridgerland series, serves as a treasure trove of stories that cover the spectrum of the paranormal. From ghostly apparitions and monstrous encounters to hauntings, disturbances in the Matrix, elusive Sasquatch, and encounters with unidentified flying objects. Okay, John, we were able to find out a bit about you in the intro already, and what we have heard there, of course, made us curious for more. Before we dive deeper into the story, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and where you grew up.
Yeah, so I grew up in northern Utah in a small, well, it was small, but it's growing quite a bit, a community called Cache Valley. And I grew up in, like you said in your intro, a home that was built in 1883. So it was really old and it was very paranormally active. And for a long time, my parents really didn't like us talking about it when we were kids, because when you grow up in a small town, you're trying to avoid being, gossip for people. So they didn't want people to think we were crazy talking about our haunted house. So I really just dove in and learned everything I could about the paranormal because of it. And later on, when I was finally able to tell my stories when I was a teenager, some of my friends came to the house and had experiences, and I had to admit my house was haunted. And so I started sharing stories. They always wanted me to share them at parties and stuff. And before long, I had people coming to me and telling me their stories. And so by the time I was 17, I started collecting and hunting them down the stories, and it's just kind of grown from there.
Okay, interesting. John, especially your last name made me curious because it sounds, I think it sounds Scandinavian, maybe Denmark, Norway?
It it is. Yep. So oddly enough, on my dad's side, my great grandparents were Danish. They came from Denmark. And my mother was raised in Denmark. She is Danish. So a lot of Danish through my family on both sides. So
Okay,
yeah.
internationally.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the name Olsen is more common in the USA than anywhere else in the world, isn't it? That's
It
all.
is. It is. Yeah, and it all comes from my great grandfather was Ole, and so his son was Ole's son, and then they just kept that as the surname, so it followed all the way down. So, and Ian is Danish, and if you find an Olsen with an O-N, then that's usually Swedish. So that's how you can kind of know the difference of where it came from. So
That's interesting.
yeah.
In Scandinavian folklore, especially in Denmark, there is a rich tradition of stories about hauntings and ghosts also. Um, Mythological creatures such as Huldas and Skogsras, female forest creatures, and as well as I think they're called Nisse and Tomte. These are ghosts seen around the house or maybe in the shed, something like that.
Oh,
Um, there's also stories of ghosts and hauntings in castles and abandoned places. There's also a rich tradition of ghost stories over there. I've read a lot about it. Um, Especially these the Huldra folk or Huldra um, are interesting. Those are women with beautiful long hair, and they wear this beautiful white or green robes, and they almost look like human beings, like human females, but they have a cow's tail.
Oh, really? Oh, I
Yeah,
hadn't heard that one. That's kind of cool, though.
yeah, and they can sometimes. There's different stories about the Huldra. Sometimes they uh, lure you into the woods, the forest, and then you can get lost or something else can happen to you. And if you disappoint her or betray her, because sometimes the Huldra is looking for a man that they can marry. But if you, like I said, if you disappoint her, yeah, it's bad juju.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, nothing.
That's cool.
Yeah, you
I'm
should.
gonna look that up. I love folklore. I like from all over the world, so I'm definitely gonna look that up. So that's very cool. We have here we have actually different kinds of creatures that try and lure you into the woods. And in fact, in some of my books, I have stories where I've interviewed people, and the big thing is when they're kids, they will have whatever these creatures are mimic um, their friends or family that look, and they look just like they're somebody they look up to, like an older cousin or something, and try and lure them into the woods. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
But
So, John, you grew up in Cache Valley. So, what's the earliest paranormal experiences that you had in Cache Valley?
so the one that sticks out to me, and I was probably around 6 or 7, I'm not sure exactly, but I remember I was in the house playing with my toy airplane. I had a little toy metal airplane, and I'd been playing with that for a while. And I went into the kitchen to get a drink. And I set my airplane down and I turned around to the sink and got a drink. And when I turned back around, my plane was gone, but there was a cap gun sitting where my plane had been. And so I looked around for my airplane and I picked up this little cap gun and I took it to my mom and said, told her what happened. And she said, "Oh, well, just play with the cap gun." And come to find out that, it was an old cap gun from the 1920s. And so that was one of the first times I remember things of mine going missing and other things being put in its place that didn't make any sense where it came from or how it showed up. But that was one of my very first experiences I remember as a little kid. That and what me and my brother and sister called the stair monster, which was basically heavy footsteps that would go up and down the stairs to our room upstairs. And that could happen any time of the day. All of a sudden, you would just hear heavy boots coming up the stairs, but there wouldn't be anybody on it. And when you're a little kid, you try and kind of put names and stuff to help you explain, and we just ended up calling him the stair monster. And so those were some of my earliest experiences that I remember.
I know these steps on the stairs that can freak you out. I had that too. We have a very old house from 1800 something that we live in, and we encountered stuff like that too here. And actually, I interviewed this young guy here in Germany. We traveled to his house, and I was with a friend, and she did a paranormal investigation in his house. And he said that years ago he was in the master bedroom upstairs, and his mother was one room uh, apart from him, and he said they heard steps, uh, yeah, boots on the stairs and steps, and it was like tuck, 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 and he was scared already. He was younger back then, and then he heard the steps on the floor. So they have this wooden floor, and he said it sounded like a big dog walking on the on the floor, and you could almost hear the claws of the dog, like tack 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 tack,
Oh, yeah.
and it came closer to his room and closer and closer and closer. And when it was in front of his door, it stopped. It was quiet. And then he saw this crazy creature standing um on his window, actually. Was standing on his window and uh, was staring at him. This is what he told me. And I was talking to a biker with vest and everything, long hair, and he had his Jack Daniels in one hand and his cigarette in the other hand. And he was shaking when he told me about that. And he said, "Man, I was so scared back then. And how can I describe this being?" He said, "How can I describe this being? I don't know how to describe it. It was small and it was hunched like a hunchback, and it was small and crouched together." He said, "It looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings." It's the best way to describe it. It was very strange looking figure. And he had turned around because he was scared back then. Then he heard the steps again, and then it disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and if you see this guy, you wouldn't believe this guy is afraid of something because it's a very big guy now.
Mhm.
Crazy
Oh,
story.
wow.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. I love that story. That's cool.
creepy, creepy.
Yeah,
Um,
very.
but you also have an interesting story. I can I did read it in your bio, and it's the story about the man in the hat. What's with the man in the hat?
So, yeah. So that was the full body apparition that we would see every once in a while. And the first time I remember ever seeing the man in the hat, I had come home from school and there was nobody home yet. My mom was out running errands, so I made myself a sandwich and then I went into the front room and I was going to turn the TV on and just watch TV and have my sandwich. And before I could turn the TV on, there was some movement that caught me attention by the doorway. It's a big open doorway. And I looked and there was this guy standing there and he was very tall and skinny, had a white shirt and overalls and a wide brimmed hat, but I could see through him and I couldn't see his facial features at all. And he walked in and he sat across from me in the rocking chair and started rocking back and forth in the rocking chair. And I closed my eyes and I counted to 10 and I opened my eyes and he was gone, but the rocking chair was still going. And so I jumped up and I ran out to the front porch to wait for my mom to get home and waited for my mom to get home. And that was my first experience with the man in the hat. But later on, it wasn't until we were much older that my parents finally admitted that they were having experiences as well. And one of those, I remember when I was a kid, I came home from school one day and my dad, the old farmhouse used to only have one bathroom and there was an entrance from the front room kind of and then my parents' bedroom. So there was two entrances to this one bathroom and my dad is tearing the door out from my parents' side of the bathroom and I asked him what he was doing and he said, "Well, mom wants this to be walled off." So I helped him wall that off and I thought it was really weird, but it wasn't until many years later I found out it was because my parents would wake up in the middle of the night and the door would be open and the man in the hat would be standing in the doorway watching them sleep. And so my mom's thought was if they got rid of the door, then he would go away. And he stopped appearing in the doorway, but there were many times that my mother said she would be in folding clothes or something, and somebody would walk in and out of the peripheral of her vision, she'd think it was my dad or one of us and start talking to them and they didn't say anything. And she would look over and it would be him and then he would disappear. And um, so, but jump forward many years later, my grandparents who lived just not very far away from us, both my grandparents had passed away. And so we were helping clean out their house. And there was a really old photo album, and I was just flipping through it while we were cleaning out my grandma and grandpa's house. And I flipped it over, and all of a sudden, I came to a picture, really old picture of my house, and standing out in front of it is a man with a wide brimmed hat and skinny with, it was him. And so after a little search, I found out that It's actually a great great uncle of mine that owned that house in the 1920s. And so I was finally able to put an individual to the man in the hat. So, which is kind of interesting. So,
Wow. So
yeah.
did it stop then after you knew who it was? No.
Nope. Nope, it hasn't stopped. And my parents still live in the house, and they still have a lot of experiences. I have even to this day when I've gone over to visit them or spend any time there, had some very interesting experiences even to today. So,
Oh, interesting.
um,
Well, the
yeah.
fact that the apparition is someone who's related to you is just
Hmm.
maybe wants to keep an eye in things. They're just like, again, you kind of wonder why these souls kind of wander around because I kind of, if I don't know, I kind of think I would be a ghost because I kind of want to, I wonder what my family is growing up and my friends and just kind of curious how the world's going to end. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
I don't know.
exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's the fact that, it was his house in life, and so he just stays there. It will the whole time I was growing up, there would be months and months when nothing would happen, and then there'd be a couple weeks where everything was very active. So who knows? But yeah, it's um I know there's a lot more than one ghost in there as well because there was one, and I don't think it's the man in the hat. I think it's somebody else who is a real trickster, loves to play tricks on people. Um, by, uh, for example, on many occasions, I would be somewhere in the house and uh, I would hear my mom call me from the kitchen. And so I would get up and go to the kitchen. My mom wouldn't be there. And so I'd finally hunt her down and and she'd be like, "No, I didn't call you." And that has happened a lot. In fact, um, when I was this is about 10 years ago, I stopped by my parents' house before I went and picked my son up from school, and they weren't there. So I just went in and I had a book, and I was gonna just sit in the front room and read my book until it was time to go get my son or my parents got home. And so I was reading the book, and all of a sudden I heard the back door open in the kitchen, and my dad call out, say, "Hey, we're home." And so I got up and went into the kitchen, and nobody's in the kitchen, and nobody's in the driveway. And so I just went back and I sat down and started reading again. And about 5 minutes later, same thing, back door opened. I heard my dad call out. And so I got up and went into the kitchen, and again, nobody's there. And I looked out the window, no car had pulled in. And then I heard a laugh behind me. Um, from behind me, I heard somebody laugh, and I said, "Oh, you got me again." And so I went back in and I sat down, started reading my book, and then the door opened. My dad called, and I just stayed reading my book, and it was actually my dad. And then he came in, and he's like, "Didn't you hear me?" And I said, "Yeah, but I didn't think it was you." And he looked at me funny, and I had to explain what had happened. So, um, and the other thing that ghost really liked to do, my dad had knee surgery around the same time, and he had to sleep in his recliner. He couldn't go to bed because of his knee. And there were times where he would almost be asleep, and somebody would come up behind him and do the two-finger cattle call whistle really loud. And he would jump, and then he would hear footsteps run off and somebody laughing. And so one of the ghosts in there is really likes to play pranks on people. But like I said, I don't think that's the man in the hat. I think it's somebody else. It acts like somebody much younger, if that makes sense. So, but it's really interesting. All the things that I've kind of experienced throughout my life there.
Oh, that's crazy. I would freak out, man. Uh, 2 or 3 years ago, or longer maybe, a woman called a friend of mine because a friend of mine, she's doing paranormal investigations. Um, she called us. This elderly woman called her, and she said, "You have to come, and you have to do, you have to listen to my story." And we came, and I brought my recording equipment with me and my camera. And we talked to this lady, and she told us the craziest story about her apartment. Man, it was one day. It started. Um, the old woman was laying in her bed, and she said it felt like somebody was laying under the bed and kicking the mattress from below. and she was in her bed like this, flying around, jumping around. And she said it was crazy. It was crazy, and it happened almost every night. Some ghost, she said, some ghost is playing tricks on me and trying to make me mad. And after a few days, she started seeing ghosts, apparitions of ghosts, women, men, workers, I don't know, forest workers, street workers, builders, nurses, everything walking through her apartment. And she said, fuck, man, I'm going crazy. What's happening here? And she said, at night, they woke her up, standing in front of a bed, staring at her. She saw a woman and a little girl at her side. And the little girl was carrying a candle, and it was burning. And they didn't speak, but the woman pointed at the elderly woman. Her name is Crystal. The woman looked at the little girl and pointed to Crystal, as if she wanted the girl to give the candle to Crystal, but the little girl didn't, and then they disappeared. And she was in her bed like, what was that? Damn. And she called a team of paranormal investigators because she was freaking out. And she said, please do something, do your magic. I wanted to stop. And they set up cameras in her house, in the apartment. And when they came back the next day, the camera was broken. There was nothing on it, and it didn't work anymore. So the battery was completely drained, and they couldn't turn it on, and it was completely broken. So the night after that, Crystal said there was a man in front of her bed at night when she woke up again. She was woken up by this apparition, and this man held a camera in his hand, as if to mock her or something, because she tried to photograph them, and he had a camera in his hand, and she said he actually took a picture of her and then disappeared. So she told us about crazy things, man. And one night she said a man was in front of her bed and with a gun in his hand, and he pointed a gun at Crystal, and had a very, very angry face, like a really brutal angry face, and she was very, very scared and turned around, blanket over her head. And when she looked up again, he was gone. So stories like that, and I think it's still happening there. Crazy.
Wow, that sounds like it's almost not necessarily the place, but her. Somehow the ghosts have figured out that she can see them, and they're all coming to let her know or something. That's scary for sure.
Yeah, I think they're coming for her, and she also thinks they are here for her, because she said one day she had to go to the hospital for a few days, and these apparitions were also in the hospital. They came with her, and when she was on vacation for 2 weeks, also apparitions, ghosts every day. So yeah, very crazy. Makes you wonder what it's all about. I don't know.
Yeah.
The Sixth Sense.
Exactly. Yeah. Being able
That
to see the
movie.
ghosts. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a few people, and these are people who don't, let people know that they're mediums or that they're sensitive. And, a couple of them said, I can't go to a hospital because I just get bothered so much by people who have passed there recently. And if they figure out I can see them, they're going to bug me and follow me home. And so, and these are people who aren't looking for, they're not running a hotline or something, claiming to be mediums or anything. These are just people that are trying to live their everyday life and not let people know that they're mediums, but yet still have trouble when they go places like that. So that's fascinating. I'm sure she's probably very sensitive, that lady. So
I also thought she could be some kind of a medium. Some people say I'm a medium, I see ghosts. Maybe she is some kind of
yeah.
medium, but she doesn't want to be a medium. She said, I want my peace, man. I just want to left alone. Want to be left
Yeah.
alone. Yeah.
Yep. That's very interesting. That's cool.
So, but tell me more about the farmhouse. I find this a very interesting place. Do you know more about the place itself, where the farmhouse is built on? Is there stories about the place too?
Well, I know that, in the research that I found, so the land that it's on was originally back in the day when they were building the railroad across the United States. The way the United States paid the railroad to build these was that they would give them tracts of land and then they would eventually sell them off. And it had originally been sold or given to the railroad, and then it was parceled off as farmland. So that's how it became a farm on there. And the first owners I was not related to, but then the second owners who bought it in the 1920s, the one that I talked about, they purchased it, and and then it was kind of in my family all the way up until now. So it's interesting that I believe a lot of them, like I said, the man in the hat are people that I'm related to. One, some of the other experiences, it was funny. One that comes to mind is about, oh boy, it's been about 4 years ago. Um, my wife and I had sold our house, but the new house we were moving into wasn't going to be ready for a month. And so we were going to rent an apartment for a month. And my parents said, well, why don't you just rent the upstairs, just stay in the upstairs, or you can save some money. And so we said, okay, we'll do that. Well, my wife was like worried about the ghost. She's never lived with a ghost before. And I said, well, I'll just say out loud that you're very easily scared, and that you don't want to be bothered, and then hopefully they'll leave you alone. And so I did that when we got there. I said, Annie's afraid of ghosts. Please don't bother her. Please leave her alone. And so for the first 3 weeks, nothing happened. And one day we were upstairs and we were folding clothes in our little apartment up there. It's not a real apartment, but it's a couple rooms. They were my rooms as a kid. And she says, you tell me all these scary stories, but nothing's happened while we've been here. And I said, well, yeah, that's because I said to leave you alone. But then I jokingly said out loud, I said, but if you're okay, I'm sure the ghosts would love to meet you. And she kind of laughed it off. And the next morning, I had to leave really early in the morning um, to go to work. And so I got up and left for work. And Annie had vaguely woken up as I left, and then she went back to sleep. And not long after, somebody slipped into bed with her and slipped their arm around her waist. And she thought, oh, did John come back? Did he come back? And then she realized that I had left. And she jumped out of bed and looked, and nobody was there, but the covers were kind of indented a little bit. And then she heard the laughter that I talked about. And so for the next week, the last week we were there, they really got after her. Whenever she was changing her clothes, somebody would walk up behind her and poke her in the back to let her know that they were there. And um, if she was alone upstairs, they would slam a door or slap the wall next to her to scare her. And after that, when we finally did move out and move into our new home, she was like, I believe you now. I know completely what you're talking about. So
Dustin, any paranormal experiences in your family too?
Yeah, actually, my dad had an experience when he was younger. I think he was around 10 years old, and him and his cousin were at his my dad's house at the time in Milwaukee, and their grandfather was in the hospital and on his deathbed. And when he passed, they get a phone call from the family saying that grandpa passed. And right when they hung up the phone, they heard the workshop in the basement where he did a lot of woodworking. He heard the saw, heard all the banging of the hammers. Him and his cousin both heard it and were freaking out, crying until the family got home and they just told their experience, what they heard and witnessed. So I guess he wanted to finish his last project before leaving Earth. He take one stop at home, and I just thought it was a interesting story that my dad likes to tell once in a while. But yeah, that's the only ghost story of mine.
That was probably his happy place. That's probably
Yeah,
where he
right.
was happy, was in his shop. I know that's where I'm happy a lot, is when I'm doing
Sure.
my woodworking. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that's what he did. So it's kind of funny that even the kids mention that, like if not making up any kind of story, like, yeah, grandpa came to visit us and did something, but it's something that he came back to for something they all knew that he loved to do. It's kind of
Mhm.
more eerie, right?
Yeah.
So hmm.
But
That's cool though. That reminds me of a story a friend of mine told. Um when so they got up in the morning and or got a phone call early in the morning, that his grandmother had passed, and um the grandma was really close to his daughter, and so they were worried about telling her, and in the morning she woke up and came to breakfast, and they're like, oh, we've got some sad news, grandma passed away. And she goes, oh, I know. And they're like, well, what do you mean, and she goes, grandma came to say goodbye last night, and she came in to my room and talked to me and told me she had to go, but that she would be okay, and then she left. And then come to find out, like, all of the little cousins that were under 6 years old had all had grandma come say goodbye to them that night after she had passed. So,
Wow.
but it was
That kind of
just the
remind,
little kids. Yeah.
that's funny. It kind of reminds me of Poltergeist too, where like the grandma dies and then the phone call on her toy phone, she gets up on said goodbye to her grandmother, and they find out in the morning that she passed.
Yeah, that's
That's
true. I had
crazy.
forgot
That's
about that. That's cool
oh
though.
yeah. Hmm.
yeah, and
Uh,
the guy I told you about earlier, the biker guy, um, told us another story in his house when he was younger, when he was in his teen years. He was in the basement with his friends drinking and partying, and they heard knocking on the door, like aggressive knocking on the door, really aggressive, because they locked the door with the key. And they saw the door handle go down and up and down, up and down, really aggressive, banging on the door. And he said, "Mom, is it you?" Mom, because his dad already passed. He said, "Mom, is it you?" And nobody answered. And they were scared to open the door, and they didn't open the door. And the banging was more aggressive and aggressive. And he said at one point he really thought that somebody's kicking the door. He really kicked the door, and the door it it was it broke a little bit already. And then he called his mom upstairs and said, "Please come down. Somebody's in the basement and trying to get in the door." And she came down, opened the door, and said, "There's nobody. What you talking about?" So there was no one. Nobody was down in the basement. Crazy story. I don't know if it's true. This is what he told us. It's a crazy story.
Could be
Um,
a horny ghost too.
or
I'm horny.
a thirsty ghost,
Let me in
maybe.
there.
Let me
Thirsty,
in.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, John, you're not only into paranormal phenomena and ghosts and stuff. You're also into cryptids, UFOs, and glitches in the matrix. Maybe. Tell us more about UFOs first.
Oh yeah. So where I live is actually kind of a weird hotspot for UFOs. Um and when I started collecting stories, I wanted to collect everything. I love all the paranormal, everything about it. And so I wanted to make sure that, even if I heard about a UFO story, that I tried to hunt it down, and people bring those to me as well. One of my favorites, in one of my books, I interviewed this guy, and him and his buddy, when they were all growing up, through their whole life, they used to go into the Uinta Mountains, which is a huge mountain range here in Utah. And if you've heard of Skinwalker Ranch, it's on the backside of the Uinta Mountains. And they had a lot of weird experiences, but they used to go up and look for, um, because the conquistadors had mines everywhere through there. They like to go up there and explore and try and, their dream was to find, lost gold and stuff. But one summer they went up on this hike, and they'd hiked way back in. It took them like 6 hours to hike back to this little lake that they were going to stay at. And they got up there, and they set up camp and had dinner and everything, and they went to bed. And all of a sudden, uh, his buddy was waking him up in his tent, and there was a light coming from towards where the lake was. And so they both walked down to see what it was. And there's this silver, what they thought was an Airstream trailer. It's those trailers that are silver and kind of shaped like almost like a Twinkie. And it looked like an Airstream trailer parked out there. And there were lights inside and windows, and they could see people walking around. And one of the occupants came to the door, and they're like, "Oh, somebody must have built a road up here. We hiked in here six hours, and apparently somebody's built a road up in here to get a trailer." And they were kind of, cussing under their breath. They're like, we'll have to move because we don't want to be around people. And so they went back and went to bed, and the light went out. And the next morning they walked down because they wanted to see where this new road that they'd never heard of it was from. And there was no road. And down where this supposed trailer was just imprints in the sagebrush where this thing had been sitting. And that's when they realized that it wasn't an Airstream trailer. It must have been a UFO sitting out there, and that they actually saw the occupants walking around. And in fact, one of them had come to the door, like I said, and watched them from a little ways away. And it was at that point they kind of got really creeped out. But um, that's one of my favorites because not only, did they get a lot of detail, but they actually saw the occupants, which I find really cool, because I have a lot of UFO stories, but very few where it was actually on the ground and they actually saw the occupants of it.
Yeah. What is the description of the occupants? How did they look?
They just looked, he said that, it was very bright inside, so they could really just see the shadows of it, but it looked like just a really tall guy, kind of a little bit weird, shaped, skinny, very skinny, he said, but at the time he really just thought it was a really tall, skinny guy. Um, he couldn't see the other ones, but he could just see them past the windows in there. But it was silver and shaped just like the Airstream trailers, so that's why he kind of thought it was. He thought it was funny he couldn't see a vehicle that had pulled it up, but he thought maybe it was just parked behind. And he had had just a thought about walking down and talking to them, but didn't. And he's like, I wonder what would have ever happened if I had. But um, yeah, so just really tall and kind of skinny, but almost human figure. But again, with the bright light from inside, they couldn't see very much detail. So,
Mhm. So just saw the silhouette of these.
yep, just the silhouette of them. So,
Very interesting. Damn.
yeah,
And it's from your area.
yes, in Utah. Yep, that was closer to central Utah, but yeah, in the Uinta Mountains. So,
So you told us it's a hotspot. Give us another story.
so the mountain range that sits right behind my house back here is called the Wellsville Mountains. And there's been a lot of UFO sightings there. I talked to an individual. They were driving through the canyon one night, and as they come around the corner, you can see the very steep part of the canyon not too far off as they're going through. And they noticed this cylinder-shaped silver craft it was glowing a little bit, and as it was coming across the mountain, it had almost like a spotlight, but instead of fanning out, it was just straight, almost like a beam, and it seemed to be looking at the mountain for something. And so they slowed down, and it was a really huge craft when they finally got a look at it. And it was moving along the edge of the mountain as they watched, and then all of a sudden it just shot up and was gone. Um, but this was probably about 15 years ago that they saw that. Um, One of the earliest stories I have in that the canyon that goes through the Wellsvilles is called Sardine Canyon. And I interviewed a gentleman who He'd been a World War II veteran, and then after he came home, he worked for the state, where they built roads in the summer and then they plowed them with the snow in the winter. And so he was working with a crew in the canyon in the summer. And when they went out with the trucks to start working on this road, they noticed on the top of this mountain was this silver thing was laying on very top of this little knoll towards the east from them. And they were watching it, and they're like, "Oh, well, it looks like a silver weather balloon that had crashed and was just laying there." And so they kind of watched it all day. And at lunchtime, he really thought about hiking up to it because it wasn't too far up there. But at the last minute, he's like, "Oh, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to have my lunch just to see what was attached to the weather balloon." And so it got to be dusk, almost dark, and they'd finished up and they got in their trucks and heading back up towards what's called the sheds where they keep the trucks and all the equipment. And he's in the second truck, and the front truck slams on its brakes, and so he hits his brakes, and the guys jump out and start pointing. So everybody jumps out and looks, and this thing that they thought was a weather balloon had turned orange and had lifted off the mountain, and it was actually saucer shaped. And it come off quiet, like no sound. It came off and went right over top of them. And then just as before it hit the mountains, it just shot straight up and disappeared. And so they're kind of aghast. And this is in the 50s. And but he always thought, wondered what would happen if he had hiked up there at lunchtime, what he would have found or what he had seen. So
Yeah.
but those are just a couple that have happened, in this area that I've documented. But it's kind of cool.
Have
Awesome
you
story.
have you interviewed any Native Americans? Maybe because I know they have tons of stories I can imagine throughout the history of just knowing the land. And you're saying it's close to Skidwalker Ranch there?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have interviewed a few of them. Yeah, the one thing that's really tough is that they're very closed off to sharing their stories. I mean, they have to really trust you. So there's definitely been a few that I've been lucky enough to do that with. A few that have had Bigfoot stories, Sasquatch stories, that shared that with me. And it's interesting because in their folklore or their more of their religion or whatever it is, you ask them, well, is Bigfoot an actual creature or is it a spiritual thing, or is it ethereal or whatever? And their answer is yes, because they believe it can be both, sometimes a physical creature, sometimes not. But they have just such great history and such great, folklore, and I just love it. And whenever I am able to talk to a few of those, they have just the best stories because even though they don't like to talk about it, outwardly, they have some just amazing stories of again, skinwalkers, which they really don't like to talk about, and Sasquatch, um, even in the Uinta Basin, which is where Skinwalker Ranch is, um, they say that it's so UFO active that either you've seen a UFO or you haven't been there 6 months yet. So that's kind of what they say about that area. So
No, I know exactly what you mean about them being kind of closed off and they want to keep it within their culture, about everything they know about all the ETs and Bigfoot and because I love the Hopi Indians and their folklore and the Kachina because that stems so much to me with the ancient astronaut theory and how they physically interacted with humans and taught them agriculture, mathematics, and um, just yeah, basically how to live off the land and stuff like that when they were
yeah,
struggling at the time. Again, awesome. And especially when if you look at these Kachina dolls, they look so robotic and so astronaut like. It's just unbelievable. I have a collection of some of them from the 1930s to the 40s. But yeah, again, I cherish them. And yeah, it's cool.
yeah, they're very cool. I love the fact too that if you look at their the artwork or the murals that they painted throughout, a lot of times you'll see what they what archaeologists I can't say that word all of a sudden. Anyway, they are just call them just swirls, but in fact they're portals that they talk about where spirits come and go. And it's kind of interesting because of some people that I've interviewed and other read about how they have seen creatures that come through those in real life, and how that's kind of interacted with their whole culture. So
Mhm.
it's really, I love it. And I hope that I am, I guess, respectful enough that people feel comfortable talking to me about it, because that's really important to me. So
Sure. Sure.
yeah.
What kind of stories do they share with you about Bigfoot, for example?
So Bigfoot is kind of in Native American culture, they call him the boss of the mountain because he's kind of like the guy that's in charge of the mountains, basically. And there's a lot of history that they talk about with most of the time living in unison and living together, but they also have stories of people being taken by Sasquatch, or it's a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you're respectful to nature, he'll be respectful to you, kind of a deal. Um, and, you know, it really is fascinating to me when I interview people about in ways that they seem to just completely disappear. Um, it makes a lot of sense to me that they could be here one minute and gone the next, which is a lot of how they are explained through Native American history, that they are both a physical creature and ethereal in that they can vanish. And that makes sense to me because in this area, I have interviewed a lot of people who have seen Sasquatch in this area, and yet, um, people go in the mountains all the time and spend a lot of time and never see anything. So, there's got to be some way that they're able to mask who they are, mask themselves or something like that. I'll tell you my favorite Sasquatch story that I collected from actually I got to be good friends with him after. His name was John as well, and he was the manager of one of the managers of this lodge that's up in the mountains up here. It's called Beaver Creek Lodge, and it's back in the mountains. So what they would do is have the managers, they'd be 3 days on, like 3 days straight on, and then 4 days off, because they would have a room for the managers up there and everything, because you couldn't drive back and forth. And it was mid-September, and it was the middle of the week, and he only had one couple that was spending the night, and he got them checked in and everything, and he did all his managerial stuff, and then he went to bed. And about 1 o'clock in the morning, uh, the gentleman came banging on his door, and he said, "We want to check out. We want to leave." And he's like, "Is there something wrong? Did we do something wrong?" And he was really kind of he didn't want to say. And finally he said, "Well, there's something that ran across your parking lot while we were on the balcony." And he's like, "Well, yeah, we've got a lot of animals up here. We're in the mountains." And the guy said, "No, this was on 2 feet." And he's like, "Okay." And so he checked them out, and they drove off real quick. They just threw their stuff in the car and left. Well, he went into the office to just put the paperwork in there, and he didn't turn the light on because he's just going in to put the paperwork down. And when he walked into the office, there's a little window behind the desk. And as he went to go put the paperwork down, he looked, and there was a silhouette of this creature that didn't have much of a neck, obviously a Sasquatch. And it was just the silhouette on the wall that was casting a light from outside. And so he just kind of snuck out of the office and closed the door. And all of a sudden, there was a bang on the building like somebody hit it with a sledgehammer. And so he's all alone now up there. And so he just ran to his room and he was sitting there trying to figure out what to do. Do I call my boss? Do I call somebody? Do I just hunker down? What's going on? And after a few minutes, he sees some lights coming up this long driveway to the thing. And so he goes down and it's a highway patrolman. And he lets the highway patrolman in, and the highway patrolman was like, have you heard any things weird going on today or anything? And he's like, kinda, yeah. And he's like, what's going on? And the highway patrolman said that people who had been driving down the canyon had been reporting that somebody in a gorilla suit was running across the road and scaring people. And he said, there's nobody up here that would be doing that in the middle of the night on a Thursday. And so he asked the highway patrolman, he said, is there a lot of weird things that go on up here? And the highway patrolman was quiet for a second, and then he said, we're actually officially not supposed to talk about the weird things that we see up here, but there's a lot of weird things. So the highway patrolman leaves, and the next day he was talking to the guy, the owner, excuse me, and told him what happened. And the owner kind of laughed, and he said, do you know how you can tell when the Sasquatch is around? And he was kind of shocked. And he goes, no. And he says, well, if you can't hear the coyotes, it's because they're around. If the coyotes are yelping, then they're not around. And he told him that when they were building the facility, building this building up there, the construction workers would come up and they had to remove huge boulders out of the ground to get the cement in the foundation. And there were times they would come up and these huge boulders would be in different places every day, like somebody just picked them up and threw them around, and they were enormous. And so, but that whole area is really kind of active with um, Sasquatch stories and Bigfoot stories. But that's probably one of my favorites for sure.
Crazy. What do you think about the idea that some people think that Bigfoot could be an extraterrestrial or multidimensional being?
It's entirely possible. The fact that I know that, there are weird things that go on in the mountains, and like I said, there's people that talk about seeing portals open and different creatures crawling out of it. Um, I'm not one to say I know there's a lot of quote unquote experts out there that, they either side with, it's a real creature or it's a mythical creature or it's extraterrestrial, whatever. I'm gonna say I don't know for sure, but it's anything at this point is possible. But I do know that there's something out there. That's one of I would love to see is a Sasquatch. I have not. I spend a lot of time in the mountains. But I would definitely not exclude any possibility when it comes to them, if that makes sense.
Mhm. You mentioned portals. It's one of my most favorite topics ever. Portal stories. Can you tell us about portals?
So I've had people that have had weird experiences in the mountains. One of my favorites is actually not a personal one that I collected, but it's one that I heard from another individual. I never was able to get the firsthand account, but apparently they were up camping and um and all of a sudden it started as a small light and they were watching and they couldn't figure out what it was. And it was about 200 yards from where they were camping and they were just kind of watching it. And then it grew, uh, and they even had binoculars and looked and they were trying to figure out where this light was. And they didn't realize that it was a portal until they saw this weird creature, like very skinny, and again, just the outline, very, very skinny and a large head, kind of crawl out of it, like it was crawling out of a tunnel, and then disappear in the brush underneath, and then it closed back up again. And then they hurried and got out of there because they did not want to know what it was that had crawled out of this. But like I said, they couldn't figure out what the light was until this thing crawled out of it, and it looked like something crawling out of a tunnel, almost like you would see in the show Stargate kind of a thing, very similar to that. So it's very strange for sure.
Yeah, it is strange. I personally know a book publisher here in Germany. He's a friend of mine. And many, many years ago, he's older than me. Many years ago, he and his wife, they were in France and they traveled through a, yeah, area with not many houses, only street and left nothing left and right. And suddenly they came to a little, let's call it village with very old houses. People were dressed funny, he said. And they stopped in front of that village and people, they looked poor. The people looked poor, he said. And he said, it's strange when we go up there and take pictures. I don't know. People might feel bad. And yeah, so they stopped and observed a little bit and then they got in the car and drove on. And the next year, when they drove by this spot, there was no village anymore. Said it was gone. They asked people what happened to the village. Um, they said there's no village here. There has been one, but it's so long ago, people almost don't remember that there was a village. And that's when he started researching portals and stuff and time anomalies, stuff like that. And he wrote books about it ever since. And yeah, it's a strange story. He said, "Man, I swear, I've seen me and my wife. We've seen this village. It was there. It was not many houses, like very small village, but it was there. I swear." He said, "I swear, it was there. We saw the people. We saw um old stuff standing around, people walking around." I said, did these people notice you? Did they look at you?" And he said, I don't know. I can't say. He said, I don't know, but it was there. I said, maybe you, the year after, you went to a different place. And he said, no, 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 no. It was this same spot, exact spot. And yeah, well, a crazy story, man. If that really happened, strange.
Yeah. I was gonna say here in Wisconsin we have Burlington Vortex. You ever heard of this, John?
Vaguely, yeah.
Here in Wisconsin. It's
Mhm.
a place. There's a woman who actually takes people on tours to go to this certain spot in the woods, and then yeah, you take these like Polaroid cameras and just taking pictures in certain spots, and all the pictures turn out swirly, and they have orbs zigzagging in through the pictures. It's really bizarre, but yeah, this certain area. I don't know if even Native Americans knew about this area too, and they had like there's Indian mounds and weird anonymous. I guess there's Bigfoot sightings too in that area. So again, very mysterious that we had the vortex portals next to Bigfoot. So yeah, makes you wonder if they travel in and out through this, or who knows? Maybe ETs have more of the control of taking these creatures in and out, just to kind of mess with us in a sense too. Because I heard other people who witnessed Bigfoot very close up actually shot at one, and it turned into dust right when he shot at it. It just kind
Oh,
of
wow.
vaporized. Yeah, so it's kind of makes you like, what? You know, makes you wonder.
Yeah, that's cool though. I like
Yeah.
that. I'm gonna have to look further into that. That sounds cool. Right along the lines of that story you were telling before, I did interview a guy who his story, him and his buddy, this was in Montana, and they'd gone up hunting and they would go up on this big mountain that where they could see into this canyon, and his buddy was on the other side. But they'd gotten up there and it had been raining, and so they were waiting for the clouds to break. And there was a big break in the clouds where he could see into the valley. But when he looked into the valley, instead of seeing the town where they were from, there was just a cabin he could see with his binoculars. He could see a cabin and an old dirt road, and then further off was some sort of military camp, and nothing else was there. And he was really he's like, did we get lost? Am I in the wrong place? When we drove up here, and he's like, no, I've been here a million times. And then the clouds came back in, and then when the clouds about a half an hour later completely broke, then he could see the town and he could see everything. But for that short time when it was a break, probably about 3 or 4 minutes, he actually was seeing the valley from like the 1800s, where there was only a couple ranches and the military camp down on one side. And so it was almost like he was looking through time through this portal. But what was really funny is that his buddy on the other side, one canyon over from him, had an experience where at the same time where one cloud like had in all of these clouds had come down bright orange and had floated right in front of him and then over towards where he was at, which was really weird. He'd had his own weird experience, but for that short time with the break in the clouds, he could see the valley like it was in the 1800s, which was really weird and again kind of vortex. You're seeing through the vortex. So
Very bizarre stories.
yeah.
Um, I've heard this story, and you can look it up on the internet. Actually, you have to might search a little bit, but um, it's a story about Stonehenge, and many years ago, you could still go inside the stone circle. I think now you can't. They build a fence around it, something like that. But back then, you couldn't. I think it was in the 70s. So there were these young people, and they wanted to camp in the middle of this circle with their tents and stuff. And as they did, a storm came up, and the storm became more crazy by the minute. And there were lightning and thunder and blue lightning, strange colored lightning that hit the rocks. And at some point, a vortex formed in the middle of the stone circle. And there was a police officer and he observed everything. He saw everything happen. And he was the one who reported all that shit. And the vortex, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And suddenly it stopped. Boom, gone. And it was quiet, peaceful, and everything was gone. But these guys also were gone. That's a crazy portal story from Stonehenge.
That is crazy. That's cool. I think I vaguely remember reading something about that a long time ago. That's kind of cool story.
Many crazy stories from Stonehenge. I talked to this older guy here from Germany. He has a lot of crazy theories. Some of them are good. And we talked about Stonehenge. He has this idea that Stonehenge could be a giant hard disk. And because this kind of rock, it can save informations. It's quartz.
Hmm.
Quartz is known to save it. It's possible that it could save informations, data. And if you only knew how to get it in and get it out, could be a big big hard drive. Interesting theory. I don't know what to think about, but it's interesting to wrap your mind around. And you also in your books you also write about glitches in the matrix. Maybe tell me more about this.
Yeah, so those really fascinate me. And I really put them in the category where these are stories that don't fall, anywhere else really in the paranormal world. One story that comes to mind, it's actually one of the, I guess, more out there ones that I've collected. This gentleman contacted me and told me his story. He'd grown up in a small town in Colorado, and in the 80s and 90s, he graduated in the early 90s. And after he graduated from high school, he went for his church. He went away for 2 years to proselyte and then had come back. And he was going to do some summer work before he went to school. He was going to go to school in Utah. And as he's doing this work in the summertime, he came to this house. He worked on those old personal computers and stuff. And he came to this house and he recognized the house. And he's like, "Oh, my friend Diana used to live here. She lives here. Maybe I'll get to see her." And it was an old lady that lived there. And he went in and fixed, replaced her modem, and he said, have you lived here a long time? Because, I had a friend that lived here. And she's like, no, I just purchased the house. The family that lived there, their daughter died, and so they moved to Arizona. And he was like, oh, so after he got done, he went to the library and looked it up and found his friend Diana's obituary. And she had had an appendicitis and died. And so he even went to the cemetery and saw her gravestone and had talked to a few friends and said, yeah, I heard that she passed away. And he was really bummed out because, they'd been friends through high school. And so jump forward, he'd gone to school, got married, um, and he'd gone back to see his mother for Thanksgiving. And so they were getting ready for Thanksgiving, and his mom's like, I forgot to get the whipped cream. Can you run up to the little store and get some whipped cream? And he's like, yeah. And so he runs up there. There's just a little grocery store, and it's really busy with people. And he's walking down to get the whipped cream and comes around the corner and gets hit by a cart. And he looks up, and it's his friend Diana with a little kid. And he's like, kind of in shock. And she's like, oh, I haven't seen you in forever, and gives him a big hug. And he's like, um, how are you? And she's like, oh, we're good. And he goes, I heard you were sick after high school. And she's like, oh, she's like, yeah, my appendix burst and I almost died, but luckily I made it. And so he's freaked out. So he forgets the whipped cream, drives right from there to the cemetery. Her headstone is gone. Somebody else is there now. And she is now alive with the little kid. And nobody else remembers it but him, but he remembers distinctly going to the house. Now her parents still live there. He remembers going to that house. He remembers going to the cemetery. He remembers reading her obituary. And yet now she's alive. So somehow something's changed. And he's the only one that remembers it a different way. And he says, I promise I'm not lying. I didn't dream it. I remember it distinctly because there was a couple weeks where I was like really distraught that I'd lost my friend, especially when I was on the other side of the world and didn't know. Back then you didn't have the internet like you do now and you keep up with people. And he's like, now she's alive and I don't know how that happened. So that's I almost call it a personal Mandela effect where it really only affects you, but you remember it a certain way. And he's adamant that he remembers everything like that and then it wasn't a dream.
Ah, I was about to mention the Mandela effect because it reminds me a lot of the Mandela effect. Wow, what a crazy story, man.
Yeah, that one was really kind of a shocker, but he's very, he had me change his name and stuff, which I'll do for some people with their stories because he likes to keep, some people just like to keep their anonymity, but he was very, very credible when I interviewed him and everything. So really fascinating story.
Absolutely fascinating. I have another question, and it's about yourself having these paranormal encounters back then. I had a few encounters too when I was just a young boy. Um, Told it a million times. Won't tell it again right now, but nothing too weird. But as a young boy, I suffered a lot from sleep paralysis. Have you experienced that too back then?
I personally have not had the paralysis. I have woken up when I was a kid to people in my room talking, and stuff like that when I was a little kid. And which was very disturbing as well, growing up in that. But I have interviewed people um who have had paralysis like that and night terrors associated with it. Um, and one in particular in one of I think it might have been my last book, I can't remember. She had this paralysis and night terrors for a long time, and she'd kind of grown out of it. But when she was visiting somebody else and staying in their front room, she'd woken up and there was this creature that had the head of a dog and black, and it walked over to her, and she couldn't move because she had the paralysis, and it reached down and kind of ran its claw like across her face, and her aunt, who was sleeping in the same room, woke up and screamed because she could see her. And they kind of she woke up or came to or could move when she screamed, and this thing disappeared in a puff of dark smoke. And her aunt did not see this creature, and she thought, well, it was just a sleep paralysis thing, until her aunt was like, what's on your face? And there was an actual scratch down her face where blood was starting to just pop on the top. And she didn't scratch herself. And so that's one that I collected about that as well. And then the people that she was staying at finally admitted that there was an entity in the house that was really angry and kind of dark, that she didn't know about until then. So, but yeah, I've never experienced the paralysis part, but I understand that's very frightening.
Oh, it was, man. I had visual hallucinations. I've seen faces that morph into each other, changing second by second. They change into another face, like really scary faces. And yeah, it's sometimes people have really crazy hallucinations and think it is ghosts. Sleep paralysis. It's yeah, it's interesting because um scientists know how it works and this and that, but they don't know they don't know why it happens and why these hallucinations and stuff like that. So they don't really know what it's all about. That's crazy.
Yeah, and the mind is such a powerful thing. It's really hard to draw a line between what you're projecting and what you're actually visually seeing and may come through. It I'm sure there's somebody that must have done a study on that, but like I say, it's your mind is such a powerful thing, and there's a big difference between what you're projecting with your mind and what you may be perceiving with your mind, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. Yeah, I understand. People talk about astral traveling, stuff like that. Liquid dreams. I don't know. It's it's crazy. I mean, if this really happens, people really are able to go on astral travels. It's crazy what you can do with your mind, with your brain.
Yeah, it really is. It's just, you know, I love to study everything I can about the paranormal, and I love the idea of the fact that your perception can become your reality. That's one thing that I find fascinating. People who study that, where you know, not necessarily where you're like you think for a couple weeks that I need $1 million, and then it shows up, but there's definitely ways that being positive brings positivity into your life, and the same with negativity. And I, I, there's just so much more, I think, in the world that we don't understand, that we're just barely starting to scratch the surface of, whether it's the paranormal or what we're capable of doing. And so it's just so fun to to interview people and be out there and go through all of it. It's really fun. And shows like yours, which bring these stories to people, they're able to listen and learn things they've never learned before about the paranormal. It's kind of what it's all about. So
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And I like how some of these stories are so bizarre that you almost can't believe it because they are so bizarre. Dustin once told me a story about a UFO. It was a UFO case where a UFO appeared in a driveway, in this family's driveway. Do you remember the story, Dustin?
Yeah. And in Meldon, Wisconsin, I think it was 1975. Yeah, this whole family of 5 or 6 family members all saw this UFO just land in their drive, or right in the edge of their driveway. And then the father got really close to it, and he said it looked like a giant turtle with tripod legs, and it had like 3 different lights going all around it, and it had this glowing aura. I say aura, and yeah, it is like it was there for about 10 minutes, and it shot up like a bullet, shot from a gun, just straight up to the sky. But yeah, they were just so bewildered. They did call the police, and they did see that it was markings left in the snow during the time. But yeah, just didn't have any other answers besides his family just totally, bewildered. But yeah, it's a famous case here in Wisconsin.
That's cool. I like that. I hadn't heard of
Mhm.
that one in particular. Um, that's cool. There's one that I've actually been studying a lot lately. It's a famous one in South Africa where a UFO landed right next to a school when all the kids were out having recess, and all of these kids saw these creatures and everything, and
Area school
it's
incident.
cool. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, to have that many people, even though they're kids, to see it and understand it, and
And I think
it's crazy.
teachers also. So yeah, it was very interesting because it was so many, and they gave telepathic messages to these children, and it's a very interesting and intense case. Yeah, it's one of the most famous cases in the world. Very interesting. But we've also come to an end, John. But before we wrap it up for today, we have to do a little bit promotion for your books because your books are awesome, and it's a lot books. You wrote a lot of books and an interesting book series called Stranger Bridgerland. So tell us everything about your books, what they are about, where we can find them, homepage, yeah, everything important.
Awesome. Yeah, so it's the Stranger Bridgerland book series. I have 7 books out right now. Um, I have another one in the works as well. And so you can find them all on Amazon, on Kindle, or softback. You can also find them on through my website, strangerbridgerland.com. You can also find out a lot of different stuff going on with me. I do a little podcast with my wife, Stranger Bridgerland podcast, and so you can find it there or on Spotify or wherever. We just kind of talk about strange things every week. And also, you can find out where I'm going to be speaking next on my pod or on my website. And if anybody has a story they want to share with me, you can contact me there as well. I love to hear stories, and I'm always collecting them. So
Interesting. The Stranger Bridgerland podcast. Didn't see that. Oh man, I missed that.
it's just a small one that my wife and I do. But we just pick a topic and just kind of talk about it for 45 minutes or so. And so
Yeah, doesn't matter if it's small, if it's a small one. Size doesn't matter. They say,
no. Yep.
Yeah,
So
That's awesome.
yeah.
awesome.
Very interesting, John. Um, I would love to have you on again. I hope we can do that someday and talk about some more interesting paranormal stories, UFO stories. It was very interesting. I had a lot of fun today, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for having me. And anytime, just let me know. I'd love to come back. So you guys do a great job. I love the podcast. So
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you for the feedback. Yeah.
you bet.
Please stay with us for 2 more minutes, okay?